If you love crime movies, you have probably come across the movie Scarface. And if you have followed the story, you will learn that the film is actually based on a true story. The movie is based on the story of Al Capone, popularly known as Scarface. But what is the true story behind the real Scarface? Is it as we see in the film? Let's find out. Al Capone, full name Alphonse Capone, was born on January 17, 1899, in Brooklyn, New York. He was an American Prohibition-era gangster who dominated organized crime in Chicago from 1925 to 1931. He built an actual gangster career, probably becoming the most famous gangster in the United States. Capone's parents immigrated to the United States from Naples in 1893, and when Al was born, he was the fourth of 9 children. He attended school until the 6th grade when he dropped out. The main reason for his leaving school was that he struck a teacher and got expelled. He went on to do a variety of odd jobs, and all the time he was working as a candy store clerk, a bowling alley pin boy, a laborer in an ammunition plant, and an apprentice in a book bindery. He was also serving in the South Brooklyn Rippers and 40 Thieves Juniors. These were 2 kids' gangs, which were just bands of delinquent children known to do petty crime and vandalism. But at the time, this was something common in New York. Capone then became a James Street Boys gang member during this period, and at the time, the gang was run by Johnny Torrio, the man who would then become Capone's lifelong mentor. And when he was just 16, Capone became a member of the 5 Points gang, where he ended up serving aspiring mobster Francesco Aioli as a bartender in Yale's brothel saloon, the Harvard Inn. Before Capone turned 21, he had already been involved in several violent incidents. During a youthful scrape at the Harvard Inn, a young hoodlum named Frank Galluccio slashed Capone with a knife or razor across his left cheek. This was after Capone made a terrible comment about Galluccio's sister, and with the scar left behind, the name Scarface came up. In another instance, Capone shot the winner of a neighborhood craps game to death and robbed him of his winnings. And even though the police questioned Capone about this, there were no other witnesses to the murder. In another incident, Capone brutally assaulted a low-level member of the rival White Hand gang and left him for dead. And when the White Hand gang leaders promised retribution, Yale sent Capone, his wife, and his young child to Chicago to work for Torrio. At the time, Torrio had just moved from New York to Chicago in 1909 to help manage a giant brothel business under Chicago crime boss Big Jim Colosimo. And when Capone arrived in the city in 1919, Colosimo was assassinated by either Yale or Capone himself in 1920. And with this, Torrio started his rule, and as Prohibition began, new bootlegging options were launched, which ended up generating immense wealth. In 1924, Capone was responsible for the murder of Joe Howard in retribution for Howard's earlier assault on one of Capone's friends. There was an attempted indictment on Capone led by William McSwiggan, an aggressive prosecutor, but it failed. This was after an eyewitness to the murder feared being harmed. They lost their nerve and denied everything, which set Capone free. Later that year, Torrio and Capone enlisted Yale and other associates to attack and murder the gang leader, Diane O'Banion, in his flower shop. Before this, O'Banion's associates, Jaime Weiss and George Moran, tried to kill Torrio, but failed in early 1925. After a stint in prison, Torrio decided to move to Italy, leaving Capone as the crime czar of Chicago. This meant that Capone was in charge of running gambling, prostitution, and bootlegging rackets and expanding the territories. And the only way to do this was by gunning down rivals and rival gangs, which he seemed pretty good at. One evening, McSwiggan was out drinking with 2 childhood friends, also beer runners, when he was gunned down, and even for this, Capone went unpunished. By 1927, Capone had an estimated wealth of about $100 million. However, the most famous of the bloodshed and attacks was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, where 7 Bugs Moran gang members were attacked and killed in a garage on Chicago's North Side. This was on February 14, 1929. In the same year, Capone served 10 months in Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia. This was after he was convicted of possessing a concealed handgun. Many Americans found Capone's story to be fascinating because of the mythical image he had. And with this, the motion picture Scarface, The Shame of a Nation, which was directed by Howard Hawks, was released. The film was loosely based on Capone, who reputedly obtained a copy of the film for private screenings. However, justice finally got to him, and on June 5, 1931, Capone was indicted for 22 counts of federal income tax evasion. This was mainly from the years 1925 through 1929. On June 12th, Capone and others were also charged with conspiracy to violate Prohibition laws that were in place from 1922 to 1931. Capone stood before the court in October, where he was tried and found guilty on 3 of the 23 counts. And for this, he was sentenced to 11 years in prison and $50,000 in fines and court costs. He entered the Atlanta Penitentiary in May 1932, but was transferred to the New Alcatraz prison in August of 1934. He then lay low, later coming to light in 1939. Suffering from the general deterioration of paresis, which is a late stage of syphilis, he was then released and entered a Baltimore hospital. He then retired to his Florida estate, where he died of cardiac arrest in 1947. He was a powerful recluse. And that's all for today, guys. Make sure to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel for more amazing videos. Until next time,